Welcome back, everyone, for our last session of the day. We're going to be covering good practice is now required, building enclosure commissioning in DC. So I'm very pleased to introduce Brian Rose. He's the Senior Project Manager at Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager. So Brian, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Let me share my screen. And welcome everybody. I figure it's been a long day for some of you, talking through different sections of the code and different things that are now implemented here in the district. Hopefully it won't be too boring, but I know enclosure commissioning and a lot of code discussions can be pretty dry. But like mentioned, I'm Brian Rose, a Senior Project Manager here at SGH in downtown DC in the district. And we're talking about enclosure commissioning and something that has now been updated into the district-specific energy codes. These are copyright materials, of course, and these are the learning objectives that you've all seen in the distribution materials sent out with this presentation. And just the outline of what we're going to talk about today is starting off with high level, what is enclosure commissioning? Why do we do it? Why do we commission enclosures? And then getting into two specific sections of the DC Energy Code, the project commissioning requirements, and then the building envelope commissioning requirements. A lot of overlap, but some subtle nuances there. And then close it out with how do we implement this? How do we get this onto RFPs to start implementing it throughout the district? So, starting off with the basics, what is building envelope commissioning? For those of you who've dealt with this before, you kind of are familiar with some of the alphabet soup that happens with commissioning. Just real focus on the right side here of building enclosure commissioning authority. The BECx is the term used in the DC Energy Code. You may be familiar with the term agent that has been used in previous NIBS and ASHRAE standards. Really, there's another standard, the ASTM standard, that refers to it as provider. That's the term that I most often use, and you'll probably hear me be using throughout the presentation, building enclosure commissioning provider, but it's synonymous and there's a lot of overlap, and it's really the same term. And then the last thing, of course, the DC municipal regulations, the DC Energy Code, 12I is just synonymous with the DC Energy Conservation Code. Now, I've always been told to start off with a quote. So what is building enclosure commissioning? According to ASTM, building enclosure commissioning is a process that begins with the establishment of the owner's project requirements and endeavors to confirm that the exterior enclosure and those elements intended to provide environmental separation within a building or a structure meet or exceed the expectations of the owner, as described in the owner's project requirements and the contract documents. So that's pretty straightforward. Things that it is not, enclosure commissioning is not a guarantee that everything will go right. It is a process that endeavors to increase the chance that things are going to go the way as expected. And it's all fundamentally based on what the owner wants with his or her building. And it is not just testing. It is not just drawing reviews. It is a process. And that process is outlined in many different standards. It all started in the late 80s when ASHRAE came together and wrote down standard procedures. It first started with the mechanical systems and the plumbing systems, and it slowly incorporated more and more disciplines throughout the project. So they came out with Guideline 0, which is a bland version of the commissioning process applied to any system that you want on the building. And then there's specific standards for the enclosure. Another thing that's very common to see is LEED. LEED version 4 and now 4.1 includes their own requirements for commissioning and definitions for enclosure commissioning. And then really the focus is today on the DC municipal regulation code. But you may come across other standards. There is a litany of other systems out there and other standards that we come across in this market. A lot of them have their own definitions and they're overlapping, so it can get a little confusing. Some project teams may follow a different standards on their past project, so they might have different expectation of what commissioning is on their next one. So I'll try to define and clarify some of these differences, but really we're using the DC Energy Code as the basis for this talk today. And the one code that I like to always use as a foundation, the one standard I should say, is ASTM E2813. Just like everything in ASTM, this is a consensus-based document from those in the industry that came together to write this standard based on how it's being practiced across the country. This is what I like to use moving forward. And it builds upon a lot of the other standards before it. Won't get into a lot of the specifics, but it is referenced in the Energy Code. And some helpful information about this ASTM standard. In Annex A1, it's a nice helpful guide on how to develop the owner's project requirements. I sometimes like to use that as a agenda for a meeting and a questionnaire with owners when we're trying to develop what the requirements want to be for a project. And then Annex A2 is a really nice long list of all kinds of different testing standards for when you're trying to put together what field quality control tests want to be performed on a given project. Every project's unique, but this is a nice brain starter to figure out what's out there and may or may not apply to each project. Okay, so what are the deliverables? What is the process and what are the major hallmarks to commissioning? You can see that it follows the standard delivery of any given project from design phase through construction and occupancy phase. You can see in the diamonds here on the right, these are just the major project deliverables. By no means is it an exhaustive list of all the different tasks for enclosure commissioning, but it starts in the pre-design, so feasibility, schematic design phase, where we're establishing the owner's project requirements. And then moving into design phase, the big deliverable here are design reviews, those peer reviews of design drawings and specifications. There can be a number of different drawings, specifications, and reviews, but that's the big deliverable, providing the advice to make sure the documents are up to speed. And then pre-construction, there's a real focus and encouragement for enclosure mock-ups, whether it's in the laboratory or out on the construction trailer, like a standalone mock-up. But it's really encouraged, and we see that a lot in a lot of bigger commercial construction here in the district anyway. And then moving on to construction, some of the major deliverable there are site visits to verify that what is being implemented by the subcontractors aligns with the design documents and the owner's requirements. And then also field testing. This is one thing that I can sometimes see some project teams getting confused, thinking that commissioning is just synonymous with testing. Field quality control testing is the only parts of commissioning. When in fact you see here, it's a holistic from the beginning of the project throughout construction. There are major deliverables throughout the whole project life cycle. And then kind of a unique and lesser talked about aspect of commissioning is once the building's turned over to the owner, ASTM and the other standards encourage a occupancy phase site visits, where you go back, talk with the facilities team to make sure what has been delivered to the owner meets their expectations. Or are there issues that may warrant enacting warranties, the installer warranties, or certain things for the contractor to come back and address? Or does there need to be more items and repair investigation that needs to go on? Again, it's really a holistic phase. It depends on the design phase. There's a lot of deliverables in the design phase and construction, and then completing the circle in occupancy phase. So that's my understanding of how I define commissioning. And now moving into why do we do this? What is the objective of commissioning? What is the value? It comes down to we commission enclosures now because the enclosures are getting more and more complex. The enclosures 30 years ago, back in the early 90s, did not have as many systems as we're putting on today. You can see here on the right is just Midtown Center here in downtown, where we've got all these unique enclosure systems and curtain walls, and they interface together. Each of these enclosure systems has varying requirements, and there's a lot of different systems out there on the market. It's starting to require very much a unique set of skills and expertise that is getting more and more refined. Also, our expectations for what those various systems need to do and how they need to perform are getting more and more stringent. Quite frankly, 30 years ago, we didn't have continuous air barriers as a requirement on every project. It might have been good practice, but it wasn't mandated. Now we see, and we're truly digesting the importance of energy performance. And the building energy performance is very closely tied to the building enclosure. So things like U factor, air tightness, thermal continuity, those are all things that through a quality control process, we can get better performance out of our enclosures through commissioning. Again, it's a quality control process. It's trying to have more assurance that the enclosure systems go the way as expected. How do we do that? How do we increase the quality assurance? And how do we reduce the risk of issues happening? Through a defined and organized set of procedures. The commissioning process very much encourages the team to write down the requirements, to write down the plan of how we're going to achieve them. So it's a defined check that nothing falls through the cracks, that we aren't up against a deadline and we forget to review the CD drawings or what have you. So it's an organized check to increase quality assurance. And then finally, more concrete is just industry and requirements out there for different standards require commissioning. It is being forced upon project teams because of that value from quality control and performance. To get 2 energy and atmosphere credits through LEED, you can perform enhanced commissioning of the enclosure. And then, like we're all here to talk today, the District of Columbia on this specific topic is really leading the nation. They're, like our neighbors in Virginia and Maryland, is not required through the building codes to enact enclosure commissioning. Now, here in the district with commercial construction, commissioning is required. And then also, finally, there's a lot of big institutions out there that have fundamental requirements that the enclosure shall be commissioning. Folks like the GSA, the Department of Defense, Smithsonian, several large institutions and universities fundamentally require their projects to have commissioning providers. One point of clarification that could cause some confusion out there in the industry that I'll help try to clarify is the term consultant or commissioning. They overlap quite a bit, some subtle nuances of how they're different. The enclosure commissioning standards encourage the commissioning provider to be engaged by the owner, whereas a consultant is more of a catch-all. We view that here at SGH as more of a hodgepodge. As needed, we can tailor the scope to the client, whether that's owner, architect, contractor, whatever the client's objective are, we can tailor the scope to meet those objectives. Whereas commissioning is more of a holistic, throughout design phase and construction, a set scope of quality assurance measures. And then not every commissioning provider has the same level of detail to it, but there is a subtle nuance on how it is perceived and how the types of advice. An enclosure consultant, not always, but often, an enclosure consultant is trying to assist the team with how to resolve the issues, whereas a commissioning provider just identifies the issue for the architect and the owner to resolve, as opposed to a consultant tries to recommend how the curtain wall needs to tie in with the opaque wall. How do we configure the flashing, as opposed to say, air barrier is not continuous, address the commissioning comments. But of course, the confusion often comes from the heavy amount of overlap between these two. It's not always the same deliverables, but many of the major deliverables like site visits, submittal reviews, construction drawing reviews, those overlap, and it's really the same work product that comes out of both consultant and commissioning. And really, it's technical expertise. My firm and a lot of my colleagues in the industry perform both consulting and commissioning. Depends on the project objectives and what the needs are. And then lastly here with the value of the project, this is just the standard project delivery method from design through construction. And where does this provide the most value? Unsurprising, it provides the most value earlier in the project. Commissioning provides the most value when you're in schematic design before a lot of those big picture items have been resolved. The further you get in the process, the more the team is tied to decisions and systems and detailing methodologies, and it's harder to steer the ship away. Then once you get into construction and budgets are established and GMPs are set, it could end up being change orders if things need to be different. For instance, 6-story basements down in 6 stories below grade down on the Anacostia. Design phase, a team may say, hey, let's just do under drain that system and go with this approach. And if you bring the commissioning provider on, they might have a different opinion, and it might be, we need to bathtub this. So we're so close to the river, we might need a big different picture of how to achieve the objectives. If that commissioning provider is brought in schematic design, it's a fairly easy decision to be talked about and decided upon. If it's bid phase and the waterproofing consultant is locking in their bid at a number, it's harder to make those changes. All right, now getting into from the objectives and what the value is to what's in the code. What's the documentation now in the DC Energy Code and how is it applied? We'll first start with this section 312 for project commissioning. Fundamentally, the DC Energy Code, as many of you are aware, we have since changed from the 2013 DC Energy Code to the 2017 Energy Code. In the 13 Energy Code, it was easy peasy. It was section C408 at the very end of the DC Code, omitted all commissioning from the baseline requirements. So that means MEP commissioning wasn't required in the district, could still be elected, and there's different paths where it could be followed. Now, with the 2017 Energy Code, we do have commissioning requirements. We went from being based off of the IECC to now being more closely aligned with ASHRAE 90.1 for Energy Code. Two different sections of the Energy Code, the commercial provisions, residential provisions. Quickly touch on an R402 has performance requirements for the thermal envelope. These are the U factors, the R values, solar heat gain, those types of things. There aren't any requirements for an envelope commissioning for residential. So today's talk is really focused on commercial projects. There's, of course, Chapter 5 that includes similar commercial provisions, R value, thickness of insulation on your roof, pretty standard things for what the enclosure needs to achieve. What might be a little less intuitive is section 11. So chapter 11 of the commercial provisions, construction and plans for operation. That's where the commissioning requirements are located. So the rest of this talk is chapter 11 of the DC Energy Code. So diving into that. I know how we all love to digest what's in the code requirements. It's real exciting, but DC Energy Code chapter 11 This is the section for the scope that says, if you have these kinds of systems on your projects, you need to commission them. Projects shall comply with the following sections. So first line is A. Section A, you need to do acceptance testing. The way that section is written, I won't dive into it. It's really more applicable to mechanical and plumbing and like how your air supply systems kinds of tests need to be done. There aren't any explicit requirements for window water testing or infrared on your roof. So it's more, the acceptance testing is more tailored to each and every project based on the design team and the consultants. All right, that same list, we get into two other requirements. Projects shall comply with, paragraph B is shall be comply with 3.1.2, project commissioning. That same line, projects shall comply with 3.1.3, building envelope commissioning. So these are two different lines, very similar terminology, but these two sections both apply to many projects. The rest of my presentation here, you'll see this referenced a lot, but 3.1.2 project commissioning and 3.1.3 building envelope commissioning have unique requirements, but are both required. So for project commissioning, don't bother getting too deeply into all these subsections. I have a flow chart in a couple of slides that tries to graphically outline what types of buildings each of these kinds of commissionings apply to. Holistically, the most common kinds of projects, new buildings, 10,000 square feet, thou shalt comply with project commissioning. New construction of 50,000 feet or more, thou shalt also apply to envelope commissioning. Okay, so further, next section down, 11.1.1. So this is the description of what the project commissioning needs to do. The following systems and associated controls, if included in the project, shall be commissioned. So you can see here in the list the types of disciplines on your project that need to be commissioned. We have our classic, our MEP, which has been in the IECC requirements for a long time. Lighting systems, if you've got dynamic glazing or dynamic shading controls on your windows, all kinds of other systems that need to be commissioned. But also, you see here a system to be commissioned, building envelope, systems, components, assemblies to be verify air tightness, thermal, and moisture integrity need to fall under project commissioning. Additionally, you'll see building envelope air tightness shall also comply with 3.1.3, and that's the building envelope commissioning requirements. So our interpretation is both project commissioning and building envelope commissioning both apply to the building envelope in the district. Something to be discussed on each project with the team of their interpretation. So here's that flow chart of what project triggers each of these kinds of commissioning. So you go into it, I've got a new construction, new building, I'm less than 10,000 square feet, no commissioning mandated by the energy code. 10,000 square feet, I need to do project commissioning. 50,000 square feet, which is also greater than 10,000, you need to do both project commissioning section and building envelope commissioning section. All right, so I've got an old building, I've got an existing building. From the International Existing Building Code, they have the definition of alteration of the various levels. But if you got an invasive alteration level 3 of 10,000 square foot, project commissioning. If it's greater than 20,000 square feet of any alteration level, project commissioning. If you are replacing, altering, or adding 25% of the facade, so a lot of that also falls into alteration level 3. But if you're touching 25% of the facade, you need envelope commissioning and oftentimes project commissioning. So you can all see how this impacts your project portfolio, but often on large commercial projects, 312 and 313 both trigger for the building envelope. All right, so 312, so project commissioning. A project owner or representative, but not design firm or construction firm involved with the design or construction of the project, shall contract with the project commissioning authority to lead, review, and oversee completion of the commissioning process activities prior to completion of schematic design. The commissioning authority shall be approved by authority having jurisdiction to conduct commissioning, having credentials set forth by the building code. The commissioning authority shall not be a member of any construction or design firm involved in the design or construction of the project. Okay, we all know sometimes the code isn't as clear as it could be. This is a pretty clear situation right here. Big impacts that we see in the DC is that commissioning can often be involved by the contractor at the beginning of construction phase, or could be contracted under the architect. Or you could see the scenario where an architect is engaging a consultant for the building envelope. Can they also do the commissioning of the envelope? Well, as written by the code, it is the enclosure commissioning provider should be engaged by the owner at the beginning of the project, before schematic design. All right. Now getting into project commissioning. So that 312 section, they break out the different scope that is required for commissioning. Of course, the building envelope is one system that needs to be project commissioned in these 4 different buckets. So the first stage of the project prior to permit, so design phase, need to have this scope of work done by the commissioning provider. Developing an owner's project requirement, then the design team needs to develop, of course, the drawings and the specification. Often the basis of design document is a narrative. The commissioning authority needs to also do 2 design reviews. And the commissioning requirements need to be incorporated, into the specifications. That most often means a Division 1 building envelope commissioning spec. And then all of that information needs to be documented to show that commissioning has been done during the design phase and gets included in the design docs that go to the permitting office. And then prior to rough-in inspection, so we're in construction phase, the commissioning authority needs to develop a commissioning plan. This is just a written document that lays out the yellow brick road of how the process is to be executed throughout the construction phase. How many site visits are going to happen, which party is responsible for what piece. So prior to occupancy phase, so we're getting into construction phase. The energy code requires construction inspections. So the commissioning authority needs to review and verify that the installation matches the design documents and the owner's expectations. There needs to be field testing, but again, the kinds of field tests and the quantities aren't explicitly required. And then need to verify the system manuals have been prepared and the owners have been trained. For the facade, that doesn't apply as much as for the mechanical systems, where you need to train for the mechanical systems. But if you've got operable shades, you've got daylighting or something, there could be some operations and manuals that need to be put together. And finally, the commissioning authority needs to put together a commissioning report and send that to the permitting office before you can get your occupancy phase permit. And then finally, that commissioning report, which outlines this is what has happened, here are the outstanding items and the items from the field report and the tests that failed. So those issues that are unresolved need to be resolved. And then you need to finalize that report that documents what has happened and then have that as a written document for the project record. All right, I know that was been a bit exhausting. Take a break here. Going through a lot of that text and a lot of the code can be a little exhausting. So we're all get into the building aspect. So I'll show a nice pretty picture of a fancy wood frame skylight. In summary, section 11.3.1.2, project commissioning, really defines a scope of work that is holistic from schematic design through construction and occupancy phase. It's a hefty scope of work that the energy code is requiring within the district. That scope of work is intended to increase the quality assurance of the project and thereby increase the chance of a high-end performing enclosure. All right, let's jump back into the next section. So the building envelope commissioning requirements. So that's the next section here in, of course, 313. So section 313, building envelope commissioning is the title, has two different compliance paths. You can follow paragraph A, which is whole building pressurization testing, or project teams can elect to follow 313, section B, which is building envelope commissioning authority. Well, you would say, hey, those terms are very overlapping here. I can do building envelope commissioning, 313. I can just do a pressurization test and that counts as commissioning. Yes, by the flow down of how this is all put together. In my mind, the building envelope commissioning authority is more akin to real commissioning, whereas pressurization test is just a test, but that falls under that umbrella. Just some terminology to be familiar with, moving on. That section B, envelope commissioning, it references the ASTM. It requires a design review prior to permitting. This section requires one design review, requires site visits, so incremental verification of the construction, requires that plan and requires that report. We'll come back to this and show how this overlaps with project commissioning in 312. But let's first get into whole building pressurization testing. So this pressurization test can go by a couple different names. I typically refer to it as whole building air leakage testing, can be called blower door testing. There are a couple standards out there and ways to implement it, but generally it involves, once the building air barrier is complete, as we know, the building facade, the roof, the windows, they all work together to make an airtight enclosure. Once that's complete, the testing agency goes out there, tapes off all the louvers, the plumbing flues, all those MEP things that have known intakes that we bring air into the building for a known reason, tape those off, blank them off from the test. Then we go to the door, we install the blower doors, hence blower door testing is one of the main names. You can see it here on the right. We put in various numbers of fan based on the size of the building. And then what the test is, we draw in outside air through the big fans, pressurize the inside of the building up, like blow it up like a balloon. We measure what the airflow that we're drawing in through our equipment. We measure what the pressure is. And then if the pressure is less than what we expect by our flow rate, we can then determine, well, that missing link there is the air exfiltration out through the envelope. So what you end up getting out of this pressurization test is a cubic foot per minute per square foot of the facade. So you get a quantified value of air leakage through the facade. And that leads into what the major benefit of this option, it's quantifiable. You have a given number that you can say, okay, my measured air leakage through the envelope is less than the allowable, spelled out explicitly in the energy code. Pass, I comply, done. Now getting into the downsides of this, you can see this coming, that first you have to have the envelope complete, which means long way into the construction phase, And many parts of your air barrier, like the air barrier below the roofing membrane or the air barrier behind the cladding elements, could be concealed and covered up. If you fail the test, it can be painful depending on where the leaks came in. It can be hard and expensive to repair, and then you go back and retest it, and you hope you pass that test. So it's a bit of a gamble to do this because it comes so late in the game. All right, so the other option is that paragraph B that I have here on the right. So again, 313, section B, building envelope commissioning authority option. And then back here on the left is the scope of work outline for the project commissioning. That was that previous section 312. Here's just a quick summary of the scope of and deliverables explicitly outlined in the Energy Code. You can see on the right, OPR is not explicitly required in the envelope commissioning. The specifications not require O&M and training. The number of reviews is slightly different, but quite frankly, there's quite a bit of overlap between the scopes in each section. All right, here's that same flow chart that we saw before. The left-hand side we already went over, which is these are the types and sizes of projects that trigger commissioning. Now, new on the right side is that summary of the scope. So 312, project commissioning is at the top right. 313 is envelope commissioning. You can do a whole building air leakage test or the BECx authority option. That authority overlaps quite a bit with the project commission. So that's really the summary of what's in the Energy Code. Here, even more text, but no need to read all the bullets. What this is a summary bolded list that summarizes the scope on the right side, scope items that's in the ASTM standard. Right side is the DC code, the Energy Code. Top right is the scope of work required in both of the sections of the Energy Code. And the bottom right is LEED. What I want to draw attention to here is the colored arrows. You can see the scope between the ASTM and DC code has a lot of overlap, a lot of meaningful overlap between the two. Whereas the overlap between LEED and the ASTM standard and LEED and the DC Energy Code, the green arrows, there's far fewer of those. And the last thing I'll highlight are these few scope items. So ASTM, if you go fundamental commissioning, requires 1 peer review, whereas the DC code requires 2 peer reviews. If you go enhanced commissioning, that's 3 peer reviews in the ASTM standard. So the number of design reviews, which is a big ticket dollar value, they can vary. ASTM encourages reviewing of the bids to make sure the qualifications from the bidder and the scope of the bidder kind of aligns technically with the documents. Another interesting piece here is ASTM requires the drawings, the shop drawings and the submittals be reviewed, which is explicitly called out in LEED, but is not explicitly addressed in the DC Energy Code. However, it does provide quite a bit of value into the project, and I'd encourage teams to have commissioning authorities also review the submittals. All right, last section, just briefly touching upon what do we do now? How do we implement the commissioning projects? How do we implement the commissioning process, onto our project teams? And doing that through request for proposals. This section, I outline kind of discussion items that the team may have. This can apply to, of course, owners who are the ones engaging the commissioning authority. Also to the project architects or even the contractors, project representatives that may be assisting the owner and advising the owner through this process. Of course, first starting kind of conversations that we see most often are what are the objectives of the commissioning process? Laying forth simply is the objective of the commissioning process just to meet the bare bones minimum in the DC Energy Code? And of course, since we just talked about, the DC has two different options. Are we doing whole building air leakage testing? Because that could be considered commissioning as well. Or are we going the more classical commissioning process of design reviews and site visits? So having those objectives clarified can level your bids between a lot of different commissioning providers that'll giving you scope of work and fees, and can avoid a lot of communication snafus and problems. And of course, what are the objectives? There may be additional beyond code minimum requirements. Are we following all of the ASTM standard requirements, all those scope items that I talked about that don't explicitly overlap? And are there well building? Is there LEED? Are there other standards that we're trying to also follow for different other clarifications? And then of course, do institutions have their own requirements? It's their building. Owners can have their own objectives above and beyond code minimum. Then the milestones. When you're issuing the RFP to engage a commissioning provider, what stage of the project are you in? The project commissioning section requires them, of course, to be involved at schematic design. There's explicit requirements to review, quote, 50% design drawings, typically design development set, and then those documents, those drawing reviews need to be sent to the permitting office for the permit. So those are explicit milestones in there. If you happen to be at a project that's beyond those, there may need to be a conversation of how we comply with the code. Do we need to have a conversation with the code official or have a letter to show how we're complying with the intent? All right, now quickly running through the scope clarification. So what kind of questions typically come up at each major phase of the project? So what scope does a commissioning provider need? First, OPR, the owner's project requirements. It's often written directly by the owner, but for unsophisticated owners or owners who've never done this before, it's common to have the commissioning authority actually write the owner's project requirements with a lot of input, of course, from the owner. This really comes down to like meetings and questionnaires for like, what are your objectives for Mr. and Mrs. Owner? Next, in the design phase, who's writing the commissioning specification? I would say it's most common that the commissioning authority is the one writing the spec, but there are some architects that likes to write that Division 1 spec. Getting into the weeds a little bit, who's specifying the testing, the construction field quality control testing? On one hand, it's common to have the commissioning authority just write down all of the field tests, the number, the quantity, the types of systems to be tested. There are some architects out there who, no, we want to have control over that. So our Division 7, our Division 8 specifications, the technical specs, have all of those requirements. And then the commissioning authority just references that in their commissioning spec. And the commissioning authority just reviews what the architect has pulled together and the design teams pulled together. Another question to help clarify the number of design reviews. Like I said, that's a big ticket dollar value. Are we doing 2 reviews? Is the team asking to do more than that because of complexity or duration of the project? Then lastly, for the design phase, it's good to clarify and set the expectation for the schedule. The commissioning provider's comments that they're reviewing on the drawings, there needs to have substantial way to respond to those comments. If the team's expecting to, okay, here are the permit set of drawings, send to the commissioning authority and sends to the permitting office at the same time, well, is there really substantial input? Is the commissioning authority's comments going to be implemented into the permit set? So having that outline of the schedule to make sure that the design team has a chance to respond to the comments and there's that good dialogue to really get the most value out of the process. Bid phase, construction phase, does the project team want the commissioning authority involved? The value that can be provided here is to just make sure the subcontractor's qualifications with their bid don't say manufacturer's minimum, we're not going to do the detailing that's in the design documents. Is it helpful to have the commissioning authority review those bids just for scope? Potentially, yes. And then construction phase. Another item that the code doesn't tell you what to do is the number of site visits. That's a dollar value that can escalate quite quickly. Is a commissioning authority doing 3 site visits, 10 site visits? Or is the team expecting the commissioning authority to be out there once a week, twice a week? Depends on what the objectives and the complexity of the project are. Again, submittal review, good point of clarification. And then finally, who's performing the test? A lot of project teams will have a different understanding of the way to do it. We commonly on big commercial projects see the owner engage a totally separate independent testing agency under a separate contract. And then the commissioning authority, who's also hired by the owner, is just observing, reviewing the commissioning, the testing agency's reports. That can work just fine. We also see the contractor often is responsible for carrying that cost. Contractor involves the testing agency, and similarly, the commissioning authority just reviews the test, observes the test to make sure they're in compliance. And then finally, there's another option that has its own pros and cons, is that the commissioning authority can self-perform a lot of these tests. A lot of commissioning authorities have the capability to do that whole building air leakage test. Or is the commissioning authority just want to hold that contract and subcontract out a lot of the tests to another testing agency? So the owner just has one point of contact, one person who's managing the whole process. There's pros and cons, but good thing to clarify when you're making the RFP. And then finally, the occupancy phase. Does the team have value? Does the team want the commissioning authority to do kind of a light condition assessment? It's usually 10 months after turnover to the owner. Is there value in having the commissioning authority go out, walk with the facilities team, and see if there's any warranty claims that need to be triggered or additional investigation and repair? That there's pros and cons, there's discussions to be had on every project. And with that, I'll close out. It looks like I have got some time here for questions. I'm interested to see what you all are seeing on your projects, or is there any questions regarding clarification or what's required in the energy code?
Great, thank you, Brian. Folks, if you want to go ahead and drop your questions in the Q&A, that would be great. We'll start with this one. Please discuss the place of operable windows in buildings subject to the energy performance standard for which enclosure commissioning is conducted.
So operable windows, they have, like historically with all of the IECC requirements, the DC Energy Code in Chapter 5 has performance requirements for operable windows. There's specific air leakage, there's U factor, daylighting, solar heat. There's all kinds of performance requirements. That's product selection and specification stuff. But as specific to enclosure commissioning, the windows are a very critical role to the enclosure and should be part of the commissioning. So in my view, in the energy code point of it, the envelope includes operable windows, just like it includes roofs, opaque walls, below grade. It's all included in the air tightness, water tightness, and thermal barrier of the enclosure. So the commissioning authority, in summary, should be looking at reviewing the submittals, doing construction site visits for the operable windows.
Great, thank you, Ryan. How is the building enclosure commissioning reflected in the permitting process?
So that's a fun part that we are all together going through at the same time, because as we know, this is a fairly new code and it's starting to be implemented throughout. But the way that it's spelled out in the energy code is that the commissioning process needs to be documented in the contract documents that go up to the permitting office. So the way that we've done this down at Buzzard Point, a big project down in the district, is that the architects spelled that out right on their code page where they outlined like how the enclosure is going to meet the performance requirements of the energy code. They just listed right in there that the enclosure commissioning is going to be done. And then of course there's a enclosure commissioning specification. So that those two areas right on the drawing page and then right in the specifications is really how it's being documented to the permitting office. On that example project, it went through and they got their permit, their permit. I've yet to have real deep dive with the permitting office on any requests for additional information.
All right, we'll give folks just a minute to do any last minute typing. Okay, we have a broader question here. Can you please summarize big picture energy code requirements for existing buildings going through comprehensive interior renovations with some envelope improvements?
Okay. I can't always say this about the code, but in this scenario, they are fairly explicit. And I knew this kind of thing would come up, so I brought the same chart that we saw before as one of my backup slides. So an existing building, if you are replacing, altering, or adding more than 25% of the facade, that triggers the building envelope commissioning requirements. So if you've got a light touch on the facade where you're less than 25% of the area, commissioning may not be required. But I will say if your project is into the alteration level 3, I would, of course, recommend everybody to look through the code as it applies to each and every one of their projects. But if you're in alteration level 3, any of those facade components that you are touching or altering, I would say that they need to be commissioned, and they also fall under needing to meet the performance requirements that are in Chapter 5 of the code. So if you replace the windows, you need to have IGUs with a certain U factor and solar heat, that type of stuff.
All right, presuming energy performance is intended to secure long-term benefits by limiting energy loss via building enclosures, how can government allow hundreds of occupants to open all the windows?
Well, anecdotally, you go over to Germany, and the German offices, every office I've been on over there for like shop drawing review parties, they all have operable windows. Like culturally, their offices aren't closed up, and they encourage free airflow through the building enclosure. The expectation is you're only opening your windows when it's nice out, and you don't need the mechanical systems running. So there is a give and take in how much culturally we trust the occupants to know when to open and close their windows, to use less of the building energy. But in global broad sense of things for like residential, where operable windows are also required, the implementation is you're going to close your windows when the weather outside isn't conducive. It's going to be too cold, so I'm going to waste more energy heating up the building. In the long term, I look at it as operable windows allow for more direct client or occupant comfort. So if somebody's hot, they can open up the window when it's cold out, and that's a free energy. We don't need to spend cooling energy from mechanical systems. We get it free from the outside. Similarly, when it's cold inside and it's nice and hot outside, you can get that free energy from the outside. We just rely on the occupant to then close the window, or somebody to close the window after it's done.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And with that, we appreciate you closing out our day. Folks, please do reach out to Brian with any follow-up questions you have, as he's always been happy to share his expertise. You can see his contact information on that slide there. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. I know a lot of you are hankering for those last-minute HSWs you earned today, so rest assured the staff here will be working on getting all those on your transcript before the DC licensure deadline at the end of the month. So please do reach out to us with any questions, and thank you again for joining us for Code-palooza.